Maxime Laurent stood at the edge of his new garden, contemplating the crystal-clear water of his pool. This place meant more to him than just an outdoor space. It was his sanctuary, the result of years of sacrifice and hard work. After his divorce 3 years earlier, he had given everything to move forward, taking refuge in his career as a civil engineer. When he finally managed to buy this house in the suburbs, he promised himself he would find peace here. But the serenity he so longed for was quickly threatened. In the first few weeks, he noticed troubling signs. Splashes on the pool's edge, towels left on lounge chairs, and one day, an empty can floating on the surface. Then he caught them. The Morel twins and their friends were enjoying his pool as if it were a public space. At first patient, Maxime politely asked them to stop. He even spoke to their parents, who simply shrugged, but the problem only worsened. One Friday evening, he returned from work to find a full-blown party happening in his garden. Not only had the teenagers invited themselves again, but this time, the parents were also involved. Music, drinks, loud laughter. They were acting as though they owned the place, with no shame whatsoever. That was the last straw. The next day, Maxime made a radical decision. He had a perimeter alarm installed, linked to an automated sprinkler system. From then on, anyone who entered without his permission would be greeted by cold water jets and a piercing siren. The following weekend, the intruders tried again and fled, soaked and humiliated. That day, the message was finally understood. From the moment it was set up, Maxime felt a deep sense of relief. He savored the calm of his new neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Every morning, he had his coffee on the terrace, enjoying the birds' songs and the soft sunlight filtering through the trees. This house was more than just a roof over his head. It represented a new beginning. His job, though demanding, left him little time to fully enjoy the space. But every evening, he found pleasure in diving into the cool water of his pool, alone, far from the stress of meetings and tight deadlines. He had promised himself to preserve this haven of peace, making it a place free from intrusions and external pressures. As the days passed, he began to get to know his neighbors. Some were discreet, others more outgoing. The Morels, his immediate neighbors, fell into the latter category. Arnaud, the father, made an impression with his loud presence and laid-back attitude. At their first meeting, he grinned and said, "That pool is a real gem. Watch out. The kids will want to enjoy it." Maxime laughed politely, not paying much attention to the remark. He had no idea it would signal future troubles. To him, his space was sacred, and he didn't see why he should have to share it. But his new neighbors seemed to have a very different view of private property. The first few days in his new house were filled with satisfaction. Maxime enjoyed organizing his interior, carefully arranging his furniture, and making every corner of his refuge his own. The garden quickly became his favorite place. He imagined long summer evenings, alone or with a small group, enjoying the silence and the soothing sound of the water. He liked the idea of living in a neighborhood where people seemed friendly, but he also knew he needed boundaries. He wasn't the type to join large neighborhood gatherings or impromptu barbecues on people's lawns. This didn't stop him from being polite with those he met, exchanging a few words with the Durands, the elderly couple who lived across the street, or greeting the young couple next door, always busy with their baby. However, he soon noticed that not everyone shared the same definition of privacy. The Morels, in particular, seemed to appreciate a more intrusive way of life. Their children often left their ball near his property, and Arnaud, the father, didn't hesitate to speak to him as though they were longtime friends. Maxime remained polite, but he felt a slight discomfort at this forced familiarity. He didn't like the idea of his space being seen as accessible to everyone. Unfortunately, he was about to discover that his neighbors did not share this view. From the very first moments, Maxime understood that the Morels were the type of neighbors who didn't go unnoticed. Arnaud spoke loudly, punctuating his sentences with hearty laughs, while Camille, always smiling, bombarded him with questions about his work, his move, and even his lifestyle. The twins, for their part, stayed in the background, exchanging knowing glances while watching the pool with an obvious look of desire. The youngest, a little girl about 6 years old, was more direct. "Are you going to let us swim in it?" she asked innocently. Maxime, caught off guard, smiled faintly. "We'll see," he replied vaguely, not wanting to appear impolite on his first day. Arnaud laughed loudly. "Ah, kids in water. Don't worry. They know how to swim. Right, guys?" The twins nodded, grinning. Camille, for her part, tapped her husband on the shoulder with a mock reproachful look. Don't bother him on his first day. Although Maxime was slightly uncomfortable with their ease, he attributed it to their natural enthusiasm. After all, it was better to have welcoming neighbors than distant, cold ones. He thanked them for their warm welcome before excusing himself under the pretense of continuing to unpack his things. What he didn't yet know was that this first encounter was just a preview of the gradual invasion of his personal space. Barely inside his home, Maxime let out a sigh as he closed the door behind him. The Morels' boundless energy had caught him off guard. He appreciated the friendliness, but he still hoped to establish some distance. His move represented a new start, a moment he wanted to savor without social pressure. He spent the rest of the day unpacking, rearranging each room to his liking. In the late afternoon, he decided to treat himself to a well-deserved break. With a steaming coffee in hand, he stepped onto his terrace to enjoy the calm of his garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light on the surface of the water. A perfect moment, until a voice called out to him. "So, how's everything going?" Arnaud, leaning over the fence that separated their properties, flashed him a knowing smile. Maxime jumped slightly, not expecting such an immediate intrusion. "Yes, thanks. Just settling in," he replied, trying to mask his annoyance. "You'll see here, everyone's like one big family." Arnaud continued. "By the way, we often have drinks between neighbors. You should come." Maxime nodded absently, with no real intention of attending. He knew that outright declining could be seen badly, but he wanted to preserve his privacy. That evening, as he lay in bed, a thought crossed his mind. Hopefully, this closeness wouldn't become invasive. Unfortunately for him, his neighbors were soon going to overstep all his boundaries. Maxime's daily routine was slowly settling in. He enjoyed the peacefulness, accompanied by the distant sounds of the neighborhood life. Every morning, he savored his coffee on the terrace, watching the mist dissipate above the water. This tranquility was a luxury he hadn't known for a long time. However, one detail quickly caught his attention. The Morels always seemed to be around, as if they didn't understand the concept of personal space. Arnaud would frequently poke his head over the fence to exchange a few words, often under the pretext of giving advice on garden maintenance or the habits of the neighborhood residents. Camille, for her part, was just as intrusive, calling out to him whenever he went outside to offer him coffee or ask for some small favor. But what bothered Maxime the most was the behavior of the twins. He noticed they often lingered around his garden, claiming to be looking for a ball or chatting with their sister. Sometimes, he'd catch their lingering glances at the pool, and it made him uneasy. He didn't want to be the grumpy neighbor, but he feared their curiosity would eventually cross a line. One evening, while reading quietly under the soft light of the terrace, he heard murmurs followed by the sound of splashing water. He immediately stood up and scanned the darkness. Nothing. Yet, he couldn't ignore the persistent feeling that his sanctuary had already been claimed. Maxime froze for a few seconds, incredulous at the scene. He had never allowed anyone to use his pool. The shock was immediate. How had they crossed a line? The twins, carefree, were having fun as if the space belonged to them, diving and splashing water with unbridled enthusiasm. He took a firm step forward, hoping they would finally realize they were in the wrong. But when they noticed him, their smiles didn't falter. The older of the two, a boy with messy hair, waved at Maxime. "Hey, how's it going? We're enjoying your pool. It's awesome here." Maxime remained silent for a moment, wondering whether to express his displeasure or simply stay calm. He took a deep breath before responding in an authoritative voice. "This is private. You didn't ask for permission." The teenagers froze, and an awkward silence settled. The twins' expressions shifted from carefree to embarrassed, but no apology came. They lowered their heads, but neither seemed eager to leave. Maxime, sensing the situation required a firmer response, repeated more forcefully, "Leave immediately. You're not welcome here." Reluctantly, the young one stood up and began to exit the pool, glancing at Maxime with furtive looks. The younger of the twins mumbled some confused apologies, but Maxime was no longer inclined to listen. After everything he'd done to preserve his space, he wasn't about to let such blatant intrusions become the norm. Maxime watched them hurry away, their faces flushed with embarrassment, but he couldn't help feeling a growing frustration. This kind of incident only worsened the invasion he'd felt since their arrival. Their nonchalant attitude toward his privacy deeply unsettled him. He waited a moment, watching the teens disappear down the garden before turning away. He didn't like being in the position of having to accuse them, but he wasn't going to allow his personal space to be violated this way. The idea that the Morels, or even other neighbors, might think they could access his pool without permission was unacceptable. The next day, Maxime decided to take matters into his own hands. He went over to the Morels' house to discuss the incident. Arnaud opened the door with a warm smile, but Maxime's expression left no room for ambiguity. "I've already explained to you that my pool is private, and I do not appreciate your children swimming in it without permission," Maxime began in a calm but firm tone. Arnaud seemed surprised, but his smile didn't completely fade. "Oh, it's just a little misunderstanding. You know how kids are," he said, shrugging. "I'll talk to them, but it's nothing serious." Maxime kept his calm, but he could feel the frustration rising. This goes far beyond a misunderstanding. It needs to stop right now. He paused, looking at Arnaud. "I'm not going to repeat myself." Arnaud nodded, but Maxime wasn't convinced. He knew this wasn't over yet. Maxime froze at the entrance to his garden, his sports bag still in hand, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The Morel twins were once again in his pool, this time accompanied by two other teenagers. They were swimming, laughing, completely ignoring the boundaries he had tried to set. The festive atmosphere around them contrasted sharply with the tension building inside Maxime. He didn't even need to take a step for them to hear him. The laughter immediately died down as soon as his footsteps echoed on the terrace. A heavy silence settled, but none of the teens seemed eager to leave. Maxime, his anger cold and controlled, placed his bag on the ground and walked toward them, his gaze as sharp as the evening air. "What part of private don't you understand?" He shouted in a firm voice, each word ringing out like a warning. The teens froze, the older twin trying to feign innocence with an embarrassed smile. "We just wanted to have a little fun," he said, lowering his head. Maxime stared at the boys, the look of a man who had had enough. "This is the last time. You're leaving now." His voice left no room for argument. The teens, visibly intimidated, began gathering their things in silence. When they finally left the pool, Maxime turned toward the Morel house. He knew that this time, he had to put an end to it once and for all. But the certainty that he wouldn't get any peace only grew stronger. Maxime felt drained, both exhausted by the incident and frustrated by having to constantly set boundaries. The situation had become unbearable, and he knew he had to act decisively to make the Morels understand the seriousness of the matter. He didn't want to engage in a long, pointless conversation. This time, he chose to take a more formal approach. He spent the morning drafting a brief but firm note. The letter was simple and direct, with no room for ambiguity. Maxime explained that he would no longer tolerate any intrusion into his garden or pool under any circumstances. He added that any further breach of these rules would result in more severe measures, and while he didn't want to go that far, he was prepared to take it to the end to protect his peace. After rereading it several times to ensure the message left no room for interpretation, Maxime went to the Morel house. He hesitated for a split second in front of their mailbox, then slid the letter inside, without even looking back. On his way back, he felt paradoxically relieved but also nervous. He had taken an important step, but he wasn't sure what would follow. He dreaded a confrontation or another attempt to downplay the situation. However, he knew he couldn't back down now. It was up to them to show respect. Maxime returned home after a long day at work, hoping to find the peace of his house. But upon his arrival, a shocking scene unfolded before him. The gate to his garden was wide open, and cheerful voices echoed in the air. He approached slowly, thinking it might be a mistake, but quickly realized that the Morels and their guests were having a party in his own pool. The bursts of laughter, the clinking glasses of wine, and the soft music floating in the air left no room for doubt. It was indeed a party being held at his place, without his permission, as if nothing had happened. Maxime felt his heart race. The anger surged inside him like a tidal wave. This time, he wouldn't hold back. He walked toward them, his voice as cold as the evening air. "Out! Now!" he ordered, with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. Arnaud, surprised, tried to explain, but Maxime didn't give him the chance to apologize. "This is my property, and you violated it one time too many. Now, you're leaving," he added, his gaze unrelenting. The guests, visibly uncomfortable, started leaving in silence. Arnaud and Camille didn't protest this time, exchanging awkward glances before slipping away. Maxime found himself alone in his garden, his mind spinning. As he cleaned up the remnants of the party, he felt a heavy sense of betrayal. This neighborhood, which he had chosen for its peace, had become a battleground, and he knew the fight for his tranquility had only just begun.